Andrew Tate ruined masculinity, but not in the way that the media wants us to believe. It's not because of, quote, toxic masculinity or some other hateful buzzword that someone who has unnaturally dyed hair and waves about a rainbow flag would have you believe, but it goes much deeper than that, to a lack of options. Before we can get to that though, it's important to understand just why Andrew Tate resonated with so many young men and boys all across the world, but in particular, Western countries like the United Kingdom, the US, and even Australia in a sense. For millennia, traditional patriarchal norms dominated society, with strict gender roles where men were the heads of households and breadwinners. Masculinity was defined by qualities like strength, stoicism, and provision, as exemplified in American cultural icons like John Wayne's cowboy persona or Don Draper in Mad Men. The rise of feminism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries challenged these traditional notions of masculinity and male dominance. First-wave feminists like Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights to vote. Second-wave feminists, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, expanded this to fight for greater equality in education, the workplace, and beyond. This evolution continued with the loud, in-your-face emergence of third-wave feminism in the 90s and 2000s, embodied by groups like Femin. It promoted gender fluidity and the like, but was also perceived as antagonistic towards men, overemphasizing female victimhood. Meanwhile, the decline of the nuclear family, with a massive rise in single-parent households, the overwhelming majority of that being single-mother households, and lack of positive male role models for young men exacerbated a growing crisis of masculinity. Many men felt emasculated and unfairly criticized, with limited places of refuge. Jobs that were all men and safe outlets now became increasingly mixed, and the representations of, quote, masculinity on television and media being a repulsive gut feeling of rejection when a young boy sees a pop star like Harry Styles in a dress. There was a vacuum left open for someone who could put forward an example of the qualities of masculinity that most males feel at their core. Cue Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate grew up between the US and the UK, developing an interesting accent for most who listen to him speak for the first time. He grew up in poverty, a council estate in Luton, England, and was in Gary, Indiana when he was in the US, with a genius father who was in and out of his life, being an adventurer and traveling chess master. This already has an origin story that many boys can relate to: poverty, wanting more, and Tate had a solution for that because the first time he truly went viral on the internet was in 2017 with his infamous depression tweet. Depression isn't real, you feel sad, you move on. You will always be depressed if your life is depressing. Change it. Thread. As well as a month prior having J.K. Rowling reply to one of his tweets with, "If you're unfamiliar with the terminology, a quote cuck is a man without a cartoon frog in his avy, and an alpha is a dick attached to a dick." He grew his brand on Twitter mainly through the Trump election, affiliating himself with the right wing at the time, with people like Tommy Robinson, the anti-Muslim personality in London, and was explicit with his accomplishments. 4-time kickboxing world champion, 6'3", millionaire, and repeated it over and over and over. But it was true, to an extent. People saw the cars he and his brother were driving, but the mystery was always, how did Tate make his money? He would eventually reveal how, and selling the method through an online program. He said that he made his money through running webcam studios with his girlfriends, then scaling it up to 70 girls at the peak. One thing he didn't really mention is that there is evidence out there of him being involved physically, recording pornography with one or more of the girls, whilst on camera. The appeal of Andrew Tate originally was don't give a F attitude, rich, hot girls, and fun travel with his boys. And to be clear, he didn't really use women as props as much in his content as someone like Dan Bilzerian, for contrast, might have. A lot of his travels were just him as well as his brother. But in 2020, he would soon add another layer to him: freedom. When the 19 happened alongside all of the lockdowns, Tate and his brother would be the first to reject masks, and chose to show everyone they didn't care and travel to the most open place in the world, Sweden. They would consistently travel, building up their anti-Matrix talking points during this time, and they were putting their money where their mouth was, and Tate definitely had a loud mouth, was constantly bragging about his accomplishments. Some would say hyperbolize his actual accomplishments. His brand of masculinity was in your face, I'm better than you, you suck if you're not rich, and began to merge into, if you're not rich, you're a slave. Men should have as many women as they want if they can. men should be aggressive and capable of violence. But for the majority of his blow-up before 2021, he was staunchly atheist, which allowed for a lot of wiggle room in morally questionable businesses such as webcam and the gambling industry. With his blow-up in 2021 to 2022, it began to appeal to a lot of young boys since his chief advertising platform was TikTok, and they loved it. Think about it, why wouldn't they? They had a guy who was on private jets, driving fast cars, with hot girls, traveling with his brother, and was also tall, strong, and a proven fighter. He might as well have been a superhero for young boys with those stats. But British schools in particular didn't like this, with many trying to, quote, teach these boys that he was bad. But they didn't understand young boys. Tate wasn't brainwashing them. Not totally. He displayed what every young boy wanted and aspired to be, and he sent his messaging along with that. These schools didn't understand that, and they didn't provide the only possible solution, an alternative. These kids weren't going to listen or respect the teachers, someone whose life they didn't want, and all they saw on TV were men being feminized. If these schools wanted to send a different message, the media would need to prop up another masculine figure for boys to choose from, which hasn't happened. And that's the problem. Andrew Tate became synonymous with masculinity, and that's incorrect. It's not that he isn't masculine, he most definitely is, but he's a brand of it, and there are several brands of it, none of which involve wearing dresses or being feminized as the media would like to portray. I'm going to use a table that we'll continuously fill in throughout this video and illustrate the masculine traits and characteristics of each of the people we'll be talking about starting today. We will list for each man how they are perceived, core values, communication style, leadership style, emotional expression, self-worth, relationships, regard for others, religious beliefs, and any potential flaws. So if we're to look at this chart, for Andrew Tate, we would get he's seen as a problematic misogynist by many, as a truth teller by some men when it comes to his core values, strength, courage, loyalty, honor. He's very direct, bold, unfiltered when he's talking to the camera, but whenever we've seen him interact with others, he's very polite. His leadership style is unapologetic, confrontational, dominating. His emotional expression says men should control their emotions. He's largely stoic, doesn't allow himself to really get irritated by other people. He's focused on achievement, status, legacy, being famous. He values traditional gender roles. He's named it multiple times that he doesn't like his women working, and he finances their lifestyle if they treat him well. He's harsh to those he feels attack masculinity and himself and what he represents, but to others, he's willing to lift them up. His religious beliefs were atheist, but since then he's become a newfound Muslim attempting to repent his past sins. And when it comes to flaws, pride, lust at a point in time, and some would say abandonment issues, although I think that is leaning too much into the psychological aspects, and I'm not interested in doing that. But the search for fame is definitely something that contributed to his downfall, so that could be listed as a flaw as well. Stoicism, strength, honor, rebellion, success, leadership, and admiration, just some of the many qualities of masculinity can all be found in a historical alternative and near opposite form of Andrew Tate. And one example of that is Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers, most famously known as Mr. Rogers for his PBS television series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, that aired from 1968 to 2001 with just a 3-year gap from 76 to 79, where it was off the air. And it was far more than just the greatest children's show in American history. The episodes followed roughly the same formula or steps, with some being replaced depending on the topic. There'd be an opening sequence, each episode starting with the show's theme song, Won't You Be My Neighbor? During the song, Fred Rogers would enter his home, singing, and change from his jacket into a zippered cardigan and swap his dress shoes for sneakers. An important detail is this signified that when he came home, he was taking off his outside clothes, hanging them or folding them, and then putting on clothes for home, keeping everything tidy and neat. After the opening song, Mr. Rogers would introduce the theme of the episode, which often dealt with everyday experiences and emotions that children face, such as starting school, feeling angry, or making friends. Often, Mr. Rogers would use the picture-picture, a magic picture frame to show videos or slides that were related to the day's topic. This segment was educational and provided visual learning about various subjects. A portion of each episode took viewers to the neighborhood of make-believe, a puppet kingdom. Here, characters like King Friday the 13th, Daniel Tiger, and Lady Elaine Fairchild would play out stories that paralleled the episode's theme, offering lessons in a more fantastical, theatrical setting. Many episodes also included a segment where Mr. Rogers would visit factories to show how common objects were made, or he would welcome guests to his home to discuss their professions or talents, further exploring the episode's theme and different job titles that people could pursue in the future. A quiet yet remarkably iconic part of the show was when Mr. Rogers would feed his fish. This routine emphasized care and responsibility, often accompanied by gentle reminders about the importance of caring for others. Mr. Rogers would also frequently discuss the difference between make-believe and reality, helping children understand the distinction between the two. And this was one of the key educational aspects of the show, but always encouraging creativity and imagination. Music was integral to the show, with Mr. Rogers often playing the piano and singing songs that reinforced the episode's themes and writing all of the music too. These songs were simple, memorable, and conveyed messages of kindness, understanding, and emotional expression. And at the end of each episode, Mr. Rogers would sing the closing song, "It's Such a Good Feeling," change back into his jacket and shoes, and say goodbye to the viewers, often with a reassuring message or a reminder that he'll be back the next day. A stark contrast from Andrew Tate, Fred Rogers would never raise his voice, yell, or insult anyone. If anything, he kept his voice far slower, far lower in volume, and a lot calmer than just the normal pace and sound of speaking from your everyday man. In today's age, people would perhaps consider Fred Rogers to be, quote, corny or, quote, lame, or someone who would allow himself to be taken advantage of. I can already hear some people making the excuse of, well, this was at a different time. Society doesn't operate like that anymore. Well, let me share a story with you. Back in 1968, there was a black man named Francois Clemens introduced as a character on Mr. Rogers' show. Clemens was trained as a classical opera singer and was brought onto the show as a police officer, which perplexed him. Growing up in the inner city, he didn't see policemen in a positive light, but consented when Mr. Rogers promised him he would have plenty of opportunities to sing on the program, and he would be making a statement to young children that there are police officers who are kind and friendly. Keep in mind, during this time in America, there were still clear problems with racial segregation and civil rights. There were still whites-only spaces that black people were not allowed to be in, one of which were pools, another of which was TV. He was one of the first black men to have a recurring role in a television program, and in one of the most rebellious moves Fred Rogers could have done, there was an episode where he invited Officer Clemens, which was his character on the show, to dip his feet in the pool with Mr. Rogers, and he would say something subtle but profound.
But sometimes just a minute like this will really make a difference.
This isn't something that you got rewarded for like in the modern day. It wasn't something that every corporation was doing. There wasn't a monetary benefit. Hell, there was probably danger of losing funding or being seen in a negative light. But Fred Rogers did it anyway, because his belief was that we were all equal. However, Clemens was something else beneath the surface. He was gay. Frank, you have talents and gifts that set you apart and above the crowd. Someone has informed us that you were seen at the local gay bar downtown. Now I want you to know, Frank, that if you're gay, it doesn't matter to me at all. Whatever you say and do is fine with me. But if you're going to be on the show, as an important member of the neighborhood, you can't be out as gay, said Mr. Rogers to Francois. You must do this, Francois, he told me, because it threatens my dream. The world doesn't really want to know who you're sleeping with, especially if it's a man, Clemens says Rogers told him. You can have it all if you can keep that part out of the limelight. Have you ever thought of getting married? People do make compromises in life. By the time I left his office, I had made up my mind to marry LaTanya Mae Sheridan. At the wedding reception, Fred and Joanne approached me and my new wife. It felt as if Fred and I were sealing some kind of secret bargain. There were many different interpretations that people had of this, but the truth is, Fred Rogers was a deeply devout Christian man. And although he didn't explicitly push religion in his show, he definitely pushed the values of it. And those were the core of his beliefs. And while he chose not to judge, insult, or look down upon Clemens, he stood firmly on his beliefs and let it be known that the only way he would continue to be on the show was to keep that part of himself hidden. Urging him to marry a woman was also out of care. Mr. Rogers likely wanted him to have a family and hoped that would change him, as well as keep him wholesome in the eyes of children. If that isn't masculine, I don't know what is. And in an era today where children are being programmed with media that showcases the entire spectrum of degeneracy via TikTok and other programs, he was there to make sure children were protected while watching his program. In 1969, President Richard Nixon wanted to cut the proposed funding from $20 million to $10 million for national public television in order to support the Vietnam War. However, Fred Rogers believed otherwise. He also had the ability to break down the walls and defenses of even the most hardened men, like he did in a hearing in front of Senator John Pastor in 1969 when requesting funding for national public television that would later become PBS in favor of the full $20 million.
Are proud of Fred Rogers, and I'm proud to present Mr. Rogers to you now.
All right, Rogers, you got the floor.
This is what I give. I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him realize that he is unique. I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health. I think that it's much more dramatic that two men could be working out their feelings of anger. Much more dramatic than showing something of gunfire.
You narrate it?
I'm the host, yes. And I do all the puppets, and I write all the music, and I write all the scripts.
Well, I'm supposed to be a pretty tough guy, and this is the first time I've had goosebumps for the last 2 days.
He proceeds to recite a song for Senator John Pastor.
Could I tell you the words of one of the songs which I feel is very important?
Yes.
This has to do with that good feeling of control, which I feel that children need to know is there. And it starts out, what do you do with the mad that you feel? And that first line came straight from a child. I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups. What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. What do you do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some dough? Do you round up friends for a game of tag or see how fast you go? It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop, stop, stop anytime. And what a good feeling to feel like this and know that the feeling is really mine. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can. For a girl can be someday a lady, and a boy can be someday a man.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
Within merely 6 minutes, he was able to take PBS funding from $9 million the previous year to $22 million. Is it not an impressive skill of masculinity for persuasion, and to the degree that you convince someone who has a reputation for being impatient and rough around the edges, who had never heard of you or your work, to not only agree to grant funding, but also have all of his walls dismantled by soft words? Mr. Rogers would also invite a 10-year-old boy named Jeff Erlinger to his show. Jeff Erlinger used an electric wheelchair. When he was 7 months old, he was diagnosed with a spinal tumor that needed surgery. But when it was removed, he became quadriplegic. And before he went to surgery again, at the age of 5, his parents asked him what he wanted, and he told them it was to meet Mr. Rogers. Jeff's sister would write to Mr. Rogers, who just so happened to be traveling to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So they would meet him for breakfast, and he would eventually end up on the show years later.
My friend Jeff Erlinger, He's one of my neighbors here, and I asked him if he would come by today. I'd like to sing that to you and with you.
Okay, sure.
It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that
hide you.
Not your fancy chair. That's just beside.
Jeff Erlanger would go on to become an advocate for disability rights, helping introduce accessible taxicab service in Madison, Wisconsin, and many other things. But in 1999, Mr. Rogers was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame, and Jeff Erlanger was the surprise guest to introduce him.
Please welcome Jeffrey Erlanger. It is hard. I'm so glad to see you. Oh, thank you for coming. My pleasure. Oh, it is. What a surprise!
It's an honor to be here tonight, to be part of your proud this proud moment. You know, when you tell people that it's you I like, we know that you really mean it. And tonight, I want to let you know that on behalf of millions of children and grown-ups, it is you that I like.
You can see the joy that it brought Mr. Rogers to see him again at such a special moment in his career. But that's how he was. He didn't care about speaking to a mass audience. Part of the reason he was so impactful and resonated with so many children is that it felt like he was talking directly to you. And he always remained humble, even at opportunities like his Charlie Rose interview.
How many kids do you think are out there who in 30 years you've influenced, who you've made a difference in and made them feel something special?
I don't care how many, even if it's just one. We get so wrapped up in numbers in our society, and the most important thing is that we're able to be one-to-one, you and I, with each other at the moment. If we can be present to the moment with the person that we happen to be with at the moment.
He could have said how happy he was that millions of children were inspired by him or learned from him or had these values instilled in them, but that genuinely wasn't the way he operated. Even his own wife, the closest possible person to him, who would know of any bad quality, when asked about anything that annoyed her about the late Mr. Rogers, said the following.
But sometimes I would come in and I would have been going at it with somebody like a garage mechanic or something who they didn't have much respect for a woman, you know, back in my day. And so I would go and I would come in and I would say to Fred, "Oh," and it'd go on, and he would say, "Well, you just never know what that man was, what was going on in his life earlier. You just never know." Well, that was just, that was not the way to handle. I wanted him to be mad along with me. but that's good because that calmed me down, you know.
If the most frustrating thing your wife could say about you was that you had empathy for other people's situations and didn't jump to be upset at them for what they did, you know you were a flawless husband. When we take a look at the chart and qualities for Mr. Rogers, we see the following. He was seen as a paragon of wholesomeness and kindness. Some would consider him dorky, but I would say he was far from that. His core values, humility, integrity, service to others. His communication style was gentle, calm, always thoughtful, and leaving a lot of room for pauses for people to think and interpret what he had just said. His leadership style was definitely leading by quiet example. Emotional expression. He encouraged vulnerability and openness, but at the right time and the right place and channeled in the right way. Self-worth. He always focused on self-acceptance and self-esteem for people being the unique person that they are and they were fine just the way that they were. In his relationships, he valued respect and equality amongst all people. In his regard for others, he was very non-judgmental and compassionate. His religious beliefs, he was a Christian, and flaws, really none that we could possibly note. Malcolm X had one of the greatest autobiographies I had ever read, as well as one of the best books on top of that, and is also one of the most influential people in Black American history. Malcolm X was born as Malcolm Little in Nebraska in 1925, a deeply dangerous time for Black Americans in the South, and he experienced a lot of violence, death, and persecution, including his home being burnt down just for being Black. He would go on to become a criminal in Harlem, drug dealing, gambling, robbery, and even pimping. After a series of burglaries, he was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison. Whilst in prison, he met another man who was very educated, and the first he saw that could command respect with just his words. Malcolm would start reading everything he could get his hands on, and eventually joined the Nation of Islam after recommendations from his siblings. He had written to the leader, Elijah Muhammad at the time, and was told to renounce his past, bow in prayer, and promise to never engage in destructive behavior again, which included and was not limited to drinking alcohol, smoking, engaging in premarital sex, eating pork, and many other things. The Nation of Islam, for those outside of the US that may be unfamiliar, was a Black group that shouldn't be confused with Islam since the beliefs are very different. The Nation believed that the white man was the devil incarnate and the demise of their race was imminent. It was an incredible group for social development because they recruited the lowest rungs of society: criminals, convicts, former gang members, people in prison, and completely cleaned them up. They left all their bad habits behind, started dressing up sharp, reading more, following strict protocols, learning useful and tangible skills for the community. And this is something Malcolm's brother was unable to keep up with, and he was removed from the Nation, which meant that Malcolm couldn't continue speaking with him. And Malcolm believed in his mission so strongly that he was willing to forsake the relationship with his own brother, who helped to bring him into the fold because his brother couldn't follow the rules. Malcolm was also very humble. He began to become known as a great speaker who was recruiting many members, one of which being Muhammad Ali, and the other Louis Farrakhan. But even in his book, he always made it known that he was second to Elijah Muhammad, and he would never attempt to become the leader. He wasn't corrupted by power despite the talent he had, and knowing everyone would have followed him. After leaving prison, Malcolm was so devoted to the cause that he never took up any habit again. He spent years without interacting intimately with women, a man who was once a pimp and surrounded by them, until he decided to get married to his wife. Faithful and honorable to his word aren't good enough descriptors, because even the FBI, who had been monitoring Malcolm X for years, said they never found any evidence whatsoever of him being unfaithful to his wife or dealing with women, which is something that couldn't be said about Martin Luther King Jr., who would frequent prostitutes whilst married, which isn't a knock to his message or work, but a testament to how steadfast of a man Malcolm had become. One of his unique traits is that he was not for anti-violence like many other activists through history. He understood when force needed to be used and why it would be justified.
But I take it then you support the freedom-loving attempts of the peaceful marchers in Alabama and these places.
You don't get freedom peacefully. Freedom is never safeguarded peacefully. Anyone who is depriving you of freedom isn't deserving of a peaceful approach by the ones who are being deprived of their freedom. And when black people in this country come out from under the mental straitjacket that the Negro clergymen have placed them in, and begin to see that the only way you can get freedom is to get it the same way the white man in this country got it from England, or he says he got it from England. He was willing to pay the price for freedom. When you're willing to pay the price for freedom, then you get it. But the Negro in this country has never been willing to pay the price for his freedom. All of the price that we have been paying in the past has been freedom for the white man. We fought abroad so that the white man in America could be free today to sick police dogs on us, to beat our people in the heads with police clubs, and to turn water hose on little women and children and babies simply because they want to walk down the street like decent human beings. Now the only way you can have peace is to eliminate those injustices, and the American white man is not going to eliminate them. He's going to talk that pretty talk, but he'll still continue to practice those inhuman deeds.
After Malcolm made his pilgrimage to Mecca and realized that the image he had of the white man in America was not that of other white Muslims he had met in his travels, he began to reconsider the nation's teachings and eventually convert to Orthodox Islam, or in his case, Sunni Islam. But he still wouldn't preach against the NOI, despite having different views because of the level of respect he had once had for Elijah Muhammad and the movement. And throughout his book, he repeatedly says that he understands he may be killed for what he had been doing, and had come to terms with that a long time ago.
As long as I represented the black Muslim movement as an example of morality, unity, and militancy, as long as I could do that, I represented it. It was when I realized that it could not be represented as that I came on and started working among the non-Muslim Negroes, as I announced in January, and I had no intention, or rather March, and I had no intention of ever even speaking on this. Had they left me alone, you still wouldn't know what really took place.
Why are they threatening your life?
Well, primarily because they're afraid that I will tell the real reason that I'm out of the black Muslim movement, which I never told. I kept to myself. But the real reason is that Elijah Muhammad, the head of the movement, is the father of 8 children by 6 different teenage girls, 6 different teenage girls who were his private personal secretary. The one who first made me aware of this was Wallace Muhammad, Mr. Muhammad's son. And I had stated in a newspaper article about an effort to take my life back in January, and at that time the Muslims denied it. In fact, they tried to make it appear to my brother that I was insane. But on a program in Chicago called Hotline, that's moderated by Wesley South, John Ali, the national secretary, admitted, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday, one of these days last week, that they absolutely were going to kill me.
What steps will you take to protect yourself from this threat?
I take no steps. I have a rifle. If anybody comes to my house without a good reason, I intend to try and use it, and that's all.
Right now?
No, I don't worry. I tell you, I'm a man who believed that I died 20 years ago, and I live like a man who is dead already. I have no fear whatsoever of anybody or anything.
This is another example of Malcolm doing what he believed was right. Despite what he stood to benefit from staying in the nation, he believed they were wrong in their approach, believed that Elijah Muhammad had broken rules that he would have kicked out other members, such as Malcolm's brother, for breaking, and he couldn't be a part of that, which he ended up getting killed 2 days after he told interviewer Gordon Parks that he felt the nation was trying to kill him. He was killed by several gunmen, all from the Nation of Islam. If we chart and evaluate the qualities for Malcolm X, we get the following. For how he was perceived, by the white people at that time he was perceived as hateful, but for others, powerful, controversial activist, and widely respected for his intellect, even by his enemies. His core values, justice, truth, honor, and black empowerment. His communication style was very powerful oratory skills, and blunt truth. His leadership style, inspiring, charismatic. He was a grassroots organizer, so a lot of one-to-one interaction with people. He was in the field with them. Emotional expression. He used anger productively to inspire others. He knew that there was a lot of pent-up anger from the oppression that the group of people he was trying to lead had experienced, and he tapped into that anger to convince them and bring them to a healthier and better life that he believed that they were capable of, and how to get power for their community and equal rights. When it came to self-worth, he was focused on racial pride and dignity, and he was very confident, but never cocky. When it came to relationships, he believed men should lead households and was staunchly honorable and loyal to his wife. Regard for others. He was very confrontational towards racists or those that benefited from racism in history, so white people, Jewish people, others. But he had a lot of compassion for the oppressed. When it came to his religious beliefs, he had converted to NOI in prison, and then he left the Nation of Islam and converted to Sunni Islam in his later years. When it came to flaws, you could say it was his early life of crime. Some could potentially say violence, although he didn't really commit violence against anyone. Some would say that view of violence, and perhaps some could say anger, but he was very, very controlling of that anger and never let it take him away from the main goal or what he believed to be the smartest potential outcome. Gus Fring is a fictional character, but I decided to add him for good measure as more contrast between the three we've seen thus far. Defining moments in Gus's early life are a bit of a mystery, but a defining moment is when his longtime business partner and close friend Max was killed for selling meth in cartel territory without permission, and he was hell-bent on revenge ever since. This was the only real, genuine relationship we see from him, and for the next 20 years he remained outwardly loyal to the cartel whilst plotting on them. Gus was very patient, but didn't tolerate bad behavior.
A dog who bites every owner he's had can only be disciplined with a firm hand or put down.
He ran a laundromat service as well as Los Pollos Hermanos, which was a chicken shop, and he was active in his community, donating to causes and well celebrated and respected in the community. He needed a great customer-facing personality, was a people person, able to get them to like him, but he also had an abnormally high level of attention to detail and professionalism in his legitimate businesses, which translated to his illegitimate businesses in the drug trade. He would hire Walter White knowing he could take over the entire market with the quality of his product, and poisons the cartel leaders in an iconic scene. The pool party led by the people he wanted dead, he takes a pill early on in the party before toasting with a bottle of tequila he brought, all of them waiting for him to take the first shot, which he does. Soon after, he excuses himself to the restroom, calmly taking off his jacket and shirt, despite having just poisoned himself, folding it, and gagging himself in front of the toilet, washes his hands, and by the time he's done, the man who followed him to the bathroom had already fallen over and died, and with a cold expression, Gus watches everyone else fall over and die. Gus, whilst always orderly, is also ruthless with a by any means necessary approach, executing his own ally Victor with a box cutter in front of Walter and Jesse, threatening to kill Walter White's entire family to maintain control, and even demonstrates some Machiavellian tactics when he drives a wedge between Jesse Pinkman and Walter's relationship for his own benefit, and to keep them from conspiring or collaborating against him. Even when he dies, Gus still straightens out his tie, standing up and calm. Whilst many would say that Gus is evil, we couldn't possibly say he wasn't masculine. And when we decide to chart him, we can see that he was perceived by some as a refined, charming businessman, a people person, but by others in the drug industry, he was very, very feared. In his core values, power, control, order, revenge, and building an empire, his communication style was very precise, strategic, and at many times intimidating. His leadership style, similar, strategic, ruthless, very orderly and attention to detail, having everything done step by step the way he had laid out, and Machiavellian. His emotional expression, very rare. He was very stoic, calm, and composed even under high-pressure situations like when he had just poisoned himself. Self-worth, you could say he was really just focused on revenge and empire or power. He didn't really see how he saw himself. When it came to relationships, he pretty much only had business relationships, no true close friendships. When it came to his regard for others, he feigned warmth, but was manipulative and coldly calculating. Religious beliefs, we don't really know. From his origins, he claimed Christianity, but clearly wasn't devout. And when it came to flaws, there was pride, greed, his murderous ruthlessness, and also certain bad habits to get revenge, which is what led to his death, and to kind of put it in the face of his enemies that he had gotten one over on them. Several of these people have similarities between them. Gus Fring is very calm and collected, organized, always has his clothes folded or taken care of, much like Mr. Rogers. He also believes in revenge by any means necessary, much like Malcolm X, but goes further than all of the previously mentioned men. I bring that forward to point out that despite the fact that these four men are completely different, they're all masculine, and we can agree on that. And whilst there is no correct way to be a man when it comes to tactics, there are certain qualities and gut feelings we inherently get when someone is not masculine, or is masculine. So I'd like to propose that there are most definitely correct pillars or foundations in masculinity, but that doesn't mean that the tactics or the way these pillars are employed are one size fits all. And morality may not be a prerequisite for masculinity because that's benefiting the society, and some see it as a way to tame or control a man, since we wouldn't say every single criminal or person who commits evil isn't masculine, and we would definitely say that they weren't moral. So it really isn't, they don't go hand in hand. That being said, what's not spoken about enough is how young men can construct their own presentation of masculinity based on pillars, but it may not outwardly look the same for every man. For instance, if we gave the same amount of money to our 3 real-life examples, they would all use it differently. Mr. Rogers would likely spend it on spreading his message or helping children. Andrew Tate would likely spend it on flashy items or lifestyle with the justification that these things would bring him more attention, thus spreading his message, which isn't to knock him either. He has spent millions donating to those in need since he became famous. And Malcolm X would likely spend it on tools, weapons, and education that can protect and equip his people with the necessary things they needed to fight against the oppression they were suffering at the time. Tate urges young men to get into fighting, which is great advice, and none of the people I described were fat or out of shape. But that takes a lot of time. And is it necessary if someone is more gifted and inclined to recruiting people to his cause? The Nation of Islam had a security group within it called the Fruit of Islam. That was, you could say, the muscle of the organization. Some called it a paramilitary wing. Would it not be taking away from the highest leverage skill of a Malcolm X, his speaking and spreading of the message, to spend his time learning to fight proficiently when he's able to command those that would do that for him and protect him, and likely better than he could even if he trained? The common pillars shared amongst all 3 of these is emotional intelligence, the real definition. All of these men knew how to regulate their emotions. Fred Rogers was largely always calm. Gus, very calm, unless he had to show anger to instill fear. Malcolm X, in the same way as Gus. And Tate, in his normal interactions with others, would fall under the very calm side with Fred Rogers, I would say. Accountability. Despite things potentially being out of their hands, they never blamed anyone and waited for somebody to change their situation. They were always proactive, figuring out how they could handle their situation and take it into their own hands. Malcolm X wasn't waiting for the government to change things. He advocated for segregation, for black people to build their own communities, and to take their fate into their own hand instead of waiting for the white man to give them something, forcing their will on the world. Andrew Tate was a guy with an odd accent that had been trying to consistently get famous for over a decade, coming into a generation where being masculine was nearly criminalized, socially speaking, not legally. Mr. Rogers wanted to have a program where he could teach and entertain children across the entire nation. Malcolm X wanted to wake up black people and turn the criminals into highly respectable contributing members of society after they joined the nation and went up against the racist government practices. Assertiveness. Andrew Tate is most times very direct and slightly aggressive. Mr. Rogers, in the case of the Senate, was very calm and persuasive, appearing harmless. Malcolm X was incredibly direct and very aggressive in his speech for what he was calling out and what he wanted, most of the time to his enemy's face on live recordings. And Gus Fring was pretty ruthless. Leadership or choosing the right leader. Not everyone has to be a leader, but if someone isn't going to be a leader, they need to have the discernment to choose the right leader to follow. Andrew Tate was the leader, but his brother chose to be second, and we wouldn't say that he isn't masculine. Malcolm X never wanted to be leader. He took second in command to Elijah Muhammad and made it known that he was following in his lead. It wasn't until he saw that he wasn't living up to the values that he was preaching that he decided to depart. Mr. Rogers led his show, and Gus Fring was second to his enemies, the cartel, for decades before he was able to take over. There are several other primary pillars I could name, but part of being a man is learning to take and analyze information on your own for your particular situation. There are not enough genuinely masculine figures that were brought to the forefront of media. So much so that Andrew Tate had to brute force it through TikTok at the right place, at the right time, with the right strategy. And there aren't going to be any presented to us for a very long time. So I hope I was able to serve you guys a couple and give you the foundation that you can now take to analyze and look into history for successful, masculine men that best embody and relate to how you are naturally inclined, and take inspiration from that and mold it into what you think would be most effective and natural and comfortable for you in the modern day circumstances. You don't need to fit the Tate archetype mold that many young men are chasing right now, and you most definitely shouldn't fit into the sissified mold that society and media has shaped the past couple of decades.